So you just got a windfall of $100 and you want to take a DNA test. But then you think to yourself, should I have somebody else tested instead? Howdy, I'm Andy Lee with Family History Fanatics, and this is an episode of a segment of DNA. Today I want to talk about who you should have tested for DNA. Now, when we're talking about DNA, probably the first person we think of ourselves, because that DNA is a part of us. And I wouldn't blame you for wanting to test yourself first. When it came to DNA testing, I tested myself first. But really, there's a little bit of an order that you should think about to get the most bang for your buck. So if you think about DNA, DNA is passed on to us through our parents. We get half from each one of our parents. So we don't necessarily have everything that each of our parents had. So that should tell us that, well, maybe we're not the best source for DNA because all of our DNA come from our two parents. So maybe we should look at them first. But then if we go back a generation, because many people still have their grandparents alive, and they have DNA that your parents don't have. So that's where you should start, is really your oldest living relatives, and that's probably your grandparents. Maybe some of you are lucky and you have great grandparents. If so, spend the money, get them tested now. The reason why you want to test them now is because once they're dead, you're not going to have their DNA to test anymore. And because they only pass on half of their DNA to each one of their children, even if you tested all of their children, you may not have their entire DNA profile. But if you test them, you're going to get that entire profile. And that means more matches with more people because you have bigger segments that they can match with. So your grandparents or even your great-grandparents should be the first group of people that you consider for DNA testing. So once you've tested your grandparents, honestly, unless you're looking at some research methods, you don't need to test anybody else to get the same amounts of DNA. But you're still going to want to test at least one more generation from them to be able to triangulate with other people and have the biggest segments. What I mean by triangulation is when you're matching three people all in the same location. Then you know that they're related. Well, if you have your grandparents and then you also have your parents, well, that's two of those three people that you need to be able to match. And so anytime you have a match, no matter how small of a segment, if they match those two in the same spot, you can be certain that you guys are related to some common ancestor. So you want to first start with your grandparents and then go and test your parents. And if you don't have grandparents, then you definitely want to test your parents. So after you've tested your parents, who else do you want to test? Well, the next group of people that you want to test, I've already alluded to, it's not you yet. It's actually your aunts and your uncles, your parents' brothers and sisters. This is really important if you don't have your grandparents that you can test. Because they passed on 50% of their DNA to each one of their children, there's some part of their DNA that each of their children share in common with the other siblings that they have. But there's also some unique parts. And so if your grandparents had several children, by testing all of them, you're going to get a nearly complete set of what your grandparents' DNA looked like. And even if your parents only had one sibling, by testing both of them, you're going to get about 75% of what your grandparents' DNA looked like. So after your grandparents, you want to test your parents. And after your parents, you want to test your aunts and uncles, particularly if you don't have the DNA from your grandparents. Who's next after that? Well, if you'll notice, you're following a pattern of going down generations. And so the next person is yourself. You spent the money on your grandparents, you spent the money on your parents. Now it's time to spend it on yourself. And really at this point, if you have both of your parents and if you have all four of your grandparents tested, you have all the DNA information to be able to match with you because your parents and your grandparents all have DNA that they've passed on to you. So why would you want to test yourself at this point? Well, one reason would be is make sure that all the records line up. There may have been a non-paternal event. There may have been a time where the records say the father was one person and DNA is going to show that no, that person wasn't the father. That could be, in your line, it could be your mom and dad. You find out that, hey, your dad is not your genetic dad. He may have raised you, he may have loved you, and you love him, but maybe there's somebody else out there that actually contributed to your DNA. You may also just like to see, hey, what parts of grandma and grandpa do I have? And without testing yourself, you're not going to be able to see that. So after you've tested yourself, you've tested your parents, you've tested your grandparents, who do you want to test next? Well, I would say your cousins and your siblings. Because again, these people are going to share some bits of DNA that you have with your parents or with your grandparents. And as you start to test these generations, you're going to see more and more how that DNA is being passed on to the different cousins, to the different siblings. And finally, the last group then would be your children, and then your children's children. If you have 3 generations of family that's already been tested, by testing the 4th generation, there's some neat research that you can do, that you can see how different things have recombined, that you can see what parts of chromosomes have been passed on through the generations. From a genealogical standpoint, having your children tested is not going to give you any more information if you already have yourself and your parents and your grandparents tested. But it is going to be able to show you how those different traits were passed on in your family. And that may be interesting for you. Plus, if any of that DNA data is ever lost for any reason, whether a database is corrupted or an account is shut down, by having each generation tested, you have an internal backup of at least part of the data available that you can be able to still match with other people. So who should be tested? Well, everybody should be tested, but start with the oldest generation first and work yourself down. And it may take a while because DNA testing isn't cheap. It costs about $100 per person, and when you think you have 4 grandparents and 2 parents, that's $600 before you even get into yourself. And that's not assuming that you have any aunts and uncles you want to test. But be patient. Test as many people as you can and see if they'll help to pay for the testing as well. And with this, you'll be able to match with other distant relatives from the DNA matches. If you have any questions about who you think in your family should be tested, put them in the comments below and I'll answer them for you. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up so that it can reach more viewers. Connect with us on Twitter at FHFanatics or on Facebook, Family History Fanatics, where we can interact with you and respond to your comments.